Thank you all for being with us. Peter Hain, you told the House of Commons today that ISIS won't be beaten unless there are airstrikes in Syria. Should the UK and the US be doing this now?
Well, the only reason ISIS have been pushed back in northern Iraq is because of the airstrikes there. Otherwise, they were running amok, frankly, with all their mayhem and medieval barbarism. But their base is in Syria as well. And if they were to be pushed, and there's no certainty that this will happen, out of Iraq by the Iraqi forces in the main, then they will simply regroup in Syria. So there has to be action in Syria. But I also said that it has to be with the engagement of the Assad regime, however unpalatable that may be, also Iran and the Saudis as well. You have to use this opportunity to try and get the key regional players to tackle the fundamental fault line in this region, which is the Shia-Sunni divide, of which ISIS are the most extreme on the Sunni side.
But on airstrikes, how can you be sure that they wouldn't just destabilise such a complex situation further? I mean, simply in terms of the geography, as we saw in Nick's report, they're spread out. How could we be sure that the strikes would be effective and not make things worse?
You have to do this with a great deal of care. That's why the start of your programme suggests we're rushing in tomorrow. I rather doubt that, and I would certainly counsel against it. This has to be done with a great deal of care, with engagement, not Britain try to play cowboy in the region, but actually engaging with the regional forces. After all, ISIS represents a bigger threat to them than it does even to us.
But you are very clearly articulating the case for Western airstrikes alongside that kind of engagement. Is that what your leader, Ed Miliband, advocates?
Well, what we're all saying on the Labour side is something has to be done to stop ISIS, and that should include the option of military action, but not on our own, not unilaterally, not just rushing in.
But would Ed Miliband support the government if they come up with a careful plan, including airstrikes?
If Ed was consulted and it seemed a reasonable plan, then I think he'd go along with it, but not grandstanding by the Prime Minister like over Syria last August, and he rightly lost the vote in Parliament.
Well, Andrew Mitchell, who backed that vote last year in favour of intervention in Syria, you've made an eloquent case today, arguing very strongly the UN has to be in the lead here.
Well, I think this is a complex situation. I think that nothing should be taken off the table. I agree with virtually everything that Peter has said, but we need to engage the regional powers, and we need to engage more widely than that. And that's why I think that it's extremely important that Britain uses its position as the current chair of the Security Council, uses its position to try and galvanise the UN into taking action. This is not a problem, it's a multifaceted problem, but this is not a problem which is going to be resolved by action just by America and Britain, and it's certainly not a problem that's going to be resolved by smart weapons being delivered from 12,000 feet.
But if you look at precedents where the UN has tried to take intervention, look in what happened in Syria last year. Russia would surely veto any kind of move towards this by the United Nations, would they not? What gives you any hope at all that Putin, in his current mood, would be supportive?
Well, the United Nations is a hugely frustrating organisation. As I wrote in this piece today, they were virtually complicit in the genocide that took place in Rwanda. But when the United Nations moves, when it gets it right, it confers an awesome authority on the decisions that it is able to take. And this is such a major problem now in the Middle East that we need the sinews of the United Nations heavily involved in any resolution that's going to take place. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of negotiation. The great powers will no doubt move the position that they're in over that time, but it's not something that's going to be resolved in the short term.
But even if the United Nations were to be able to get some agreement, as you acknowledge, it would take a long time. Now, with the Prime Minister saying that right now this is a direct threat to the UK, are you willing to put British safety and what happens here, the threat to our streets, in the hands of a tangled, frustrating bureaucracy like the UN?
No, absolutely not. And of course, Britain, as part of NATO, may play a role. But I think that the United Nations confers an authority. The United Nations is the right organisation for us now to try and make significant progress. And Britain has a key role to play through our diplomatic reach and through our role in the United Nations in trying to galvanise opinion across the region, across the world, to focus on this very serious problem.
Joe Klein, does President Obama have any faith in the UN being able to grasp this problem?
I think he'd like to have faith in the UN, but I don't think that any rational observer of the region can really have all that much faith, although I agree that we should make that move. There are other moves that are far more important, and those involve the regional players there. Iran, Iraq, which has already, said that they wish to cooperate with us. The Arab League. I think that, as one of the guests in London said, that ISIS is a greater threat to the region than it is to us. And I would hope that we'd be able to put together a regional coalition with U.S., U.K., and some European support to take action in this case, but measured action. I think it's really has to be really clear to the American and British publics that we are not talking about a cowboy George W. Bush send in gazillions of troops and overrun Iraq again sort of operation. For this to work, it has to be very targeted airstrikes, and it has to be the use of special operators on the ground.
And Joe Klein, how close, therefore, given what you describe as President Obama's ambition for a coalition of the willing, if you like, how close do you feel he is to actually making a decision that he must act? Because the view of so far has been sort of prevarication, real difficulty with taking a decision.
Well, I think that you have to remember that that even George W. Bush took over a month to react to 9/11. And the Afghanistan operation really should be a model here, because it was very few boots on the ground, the strategic and tactical use of air power, and against a rather weak, a less daunting enemy.
But it was involvement that then
ISIS
went on for years and years and years.
Yes, and that's in part because it didn't remain a targeted, measured, special forces-led effort. I mean, a lot of that has to rest on both presidents, Bush, who increased the troop levels, and Obama, who significantly increased the troop levels in Afghanistan.
Andrew Mitchell.
I think that the era of Western powers launching massive assaults on Islamic countries really has to end. It has ended.
Andrew Mitchell, if action were to be taken without a vote in Parliament, what do you think the reaction would be? I mean, we've all casted our mind back to this time last year where the vote in Parliament was so critical. Could it happen now without a vote taking place?
Well, I don't think you require a vote for certain types of military action, but I think the government would be wise to ensure that any action they take is supported by Parliament. It would be a big mistake to ignore Parliament in this.
Peter Hain, possible without a vote in Parliament?
Depends what it is. If it was a question of rescuing hostages, you don't need a vote in Parliament. If it's a wider attack, you do. The elephant in the room here on the Syrian side of this equation is the Assad regime. There's an unwillingness in Washington and so far in London to recognize Assad is in place. We don't like him. He's a barbarous dictator. He's done awful things. He's backed, however, by 40% of his own population. And they're up against ISIS now. They may not like him, but they fear ISIS much more. You have to engage with Assad. You will not resolve the Syrian side of this conflict unless you do that.
So you're clear we should talk to Assad. Andrew Mitchell, should David Cameron be talking to Assad?
I think we've now reached a position where it is impossible to say no to almost any option now in dealing with this very complex and difficult problem.